Imagine, if you will, a world far larger than the one you know. Grass towers over your head as you pass through the underbrush. The hair on your neck stands on end with every sound, for the most common of things, birds, insects, laughing children, are far larger and far more dangerous. You must always be on guard for the great apes, gargantuan, highly intelligent beasts that have swarmed across the earth like an army of implacable ants. They have built many machines, the most humble of which may prove to be death traps for you. And if they spot you, they will kill you. So you, and I, and our like, are relegated to the tiny places, the fringes, where we aren't noticed, crawling through walls, skittering through grass and field, humble like the dust, where the gaze of the apes doesn't reach. We cannot farm, in the traditional sense, and so we must gather and hunt. Our heroes are those who venture into the realm of giants, returning with a bountiful harvest, like Jack the Giant Slayer, descending from the beanstalk. Where are we? On Earth, of course, in the most common of places you can imagine. No, friend, the real question is, what are we? Allow me to introduce you to Edge of the Gorge, a tiny village of upturned tin cans and other assorted containers. Shreds of cloth hang across each opening. At the far end of the village, in a great horizontal coffee pot, you'll find the mayor's residence. At the center of the village, only a faint, flickering ember to the great apes, but a roaring bonfire to you and I. The firekeeper, a crippled old man dressed in a flimsy robe, a hood drawn over his face, tends to the flame, adding fuel as it dies down and building it back up again. A long, slender, lightly furred tail trails behind him as he staggers in circles around it. You've worked it out by now, I assume, what we are? Small, pesky raiders living off a race of terrifying giants? If not, perhaps the approaching little wagon, drawn by a pair of large grasshoppers and filled with hunks of bread, cheese, and bits of celery and nuts might give it away. The driver's nose twitches absently, his grand whiskers tickling his lips with the motion. A scout bounds up to him, quick and agile, to inform the driver that the way is clear, and into the village they roll, these thieves and pests to the great apes, but heroes to mouse-kind. So life goes for the mice of Edge of the Gorge, cycling through the years, through the generations, or should I say, so it went.
So, are there any questions?
Elizabeth Hartley was met with a wall of silence, and the listless, soulless gazes of children that had been trapped in a classroom for far too long, instead of running free outside. Elizabeth smirked, very much aware of and sympathizing with the unspoken sentiments of her students. The book on her desk closed with the faint rustling of its ancient pages as Elizabeth guided each of them lovingly into place.
Then we're done for the day.
No sooner had Elizabeth said it than the schoolhouse erupted into such chaos as only a throng of freshly freed prisoners could summon. A less disciplined mouse would have burst into laughter at the sight, but Elizabeth Hartley was well aware of the need to keep a level head. The children were soon to leave her care, and it was up to her to see that they got a safe start.
Now remember,
Elizabeth began, scarcely attempting to penetrate the din.
Keep to the right of the path. Stay away from the edge. I don't want any of you falling over the side.
It was a speech Elizabeth had made many times before, and her students knew it well. All, of course, except for little Chrissy, a tiny mouse who had just attended her first day mid-season, and who now stared wide-eyed at Elizabeth, her tiny stomach sinking and twisting into knots as the warning settled into her young mind. Though Elizabeth's warning had been purely practical, the gorge was a wild, rocky, and difficult place to leave, after all Chrissy could think of was a story she once heard, which had sent her crying in terror to her mother's arms. The story of the monster of the gorge. Elizabeth took no notice of the frightened little mouse, though it was unexpected for a child to remain in the schoolhouse after being told they could leave. It was not unheard of. The younger ones occasionally needed a little help getting their things together, and putting on jackets and the like in colder weather. If the child was still there once Elizabeth had closed up for the night, then there might be some cause for concern. The schoolhouse, as I've called it, was really only an empty tomato juice can, which had long since been rinsed out with rainwater. Now dry, and shored up on either side with rows of piled pebbles, it served as a remarkably secure shelter, with plenty of room for Elizabeth's abundant shelves of books. A curtain of ragged cloth, drawn across the breadth of the can, separated the public, educational half from Elizabeth's private chamber, where she kept her shares of the community's food and her personal collection of books. Now a center for information, thanks to the bookish mouse, it was only natural that it should also serve as a schoolhouse, with Elizabeth, the can's resident and self-appointed librarian, serving as a schoolmarm. The only problem with the whole arrangement was the dwelling's location. It sat apart from the main community, tucked away amid a bed of tall grass, sprouting from a knot in the giant roots of an ancient tree, connected to the rest of the village only by a winding path along a steep ledge overlooking the gorge. This gorge, I've mentioned a number of times, was really little more than a drainage ditch, dug by the great apes as a channel for rainwater. To us, however, it has always been and will always be a dangerous place to be avoided. A rocky riverbed inhabited by swarms of flies, ravenous spiders, and the dreaded centipedes. I realize one does not typically regard insects and their kin as threatening, but a large centipede can be extremely aggressive. Combine that with a venomous bite and a hunger for rodent flesh, and you have what may as well be a real-life dragon. Then, of course, you have the legends and ghost stories, such as the one which troubled our young friend at this very moment.
Still here?
Chrissy jumped, shaken out of her stupor at the sound of Elizabeth's voice.
Are you waiting for someone?
Chrissy had not been. Quite the opposite, someone had been waiting for her. Before sending her off to school, Chrissy's mother had instructed her to stick close to her brother. The older mouse, however, had grown impatient and left on his own. Now Chrissy faced the prospect of a long, lonely path home, with only the shadowy, forbidding grass to her right and the monster to her left for company. Chrissy shook her head.
Well, you don't want to stay here all night,
Elizabeth added.
You'll see plenty of it tomorrow. Now off you go.
With that, she ushered the child to the schoolhouse's exit. A massive red curtain hung across the opening in the far end of the can. Elizabeth watched and waited as Chrissy nosed her way out the door, peering into the dying evening twilight. She took a few tentative steps outside. The open air closed in around her, and she suddenly felt very much exposed. In her young mind, she could plainly hear the scream of the monster on the hunt. With a cry of terror, Chrissy darted back inside and found herself enfolded in the waiting arms of Elizabeth Hartley.
Hush,
Elizabeth whispered.
hush. There's nothing to be afraid of.
But you said I might fall in the gorge.
Elizabeth took a step back and looked Chrissy in the eyes.
You won't. You know better.
But you said...
I said to stay to the right of the path, so that you don't fall in. I trust you to do that.
But what if the monster climbs up and pulls me down?
Elizabeth held her expression firm and straight, but inside she was chuckling.
You're Chrissy, aren't you?
Yes'm.
Which would make you Will's sister?
Yes'm.
Elizabeth allowed a knowing smile to surface.
He's been telling you stories, hasn't he?
Will said a mouse went crazy, and everyone chased him into the gorge, where he ate spiders and centipedes and got big, bigger than the rest of us.
Chrissy paused, shaking.
And that's why nobody goes in the gorge.
Elizabeth shook her head.
No, we don't go in the gorge because there isn't a way back out.
Chrissy was silent, but remained rooted to the spot.
All right, then.
Elizabeth spoke up.
What if I go with you?
No answer was forthcoming, but Elizabeth didn't need one. The child would probably have stood there shaking all night if Elizabeth let her. With no further response forthcoming, Elizabeth wrapped an old, faded red cloak about her shoulders and drew the curtain aside.
Let's go now.
With that, she took little Chrissy by the hand and led the child out onto the path. Elizabeth took care to keep Chrissy to her right, as far from the ledge as possible. This appeared to keep the young mouse just calm enough to put one foot in front of the other. Chrissy pressed close to Elizabeth, as if for shelter. These were strange places to her, and quite large compared to her backyard, which was closed in by a number of neighboring homes. There were many new sounds, all the louder this far from the other mice. Chrissy was naturally jumpy. Here, as the quiet pressed in, she found herself panicking. She was a ripe mark for mischief. A twig snapped. Elizabeth, being taller, could see what was coming just moments before Chrissy, just long enough for her mind to roll its eyes and shake its head in disgust. There was a loud, albeit rather weak, shout. That pathetic sort of roar that only a little boy pretending to be a big, scary monster can make, as Will burst out of the grass, arms held high, standing on his tiptoes to make himself look larger. Elizabeth, even prepared as she was, couldn't hold on as Chrissy gave a squeak of fright and darted in the opposite direction. Chrissy wailed in abject horror. Will howled with laughter. Elizabeth slapped her forehead, took a deep breath, and silently counted to 10. No, she would not haul Will to his feet by his ear. No, she would not read him the riot act. No, she would not march him over to Chrissy's side and make him apologize. That could wait until class the following morning. And no, she would not even think of tossing Will over the side of the cliff to contend with this monster he'd concocted to scare his sister. Will was a mischievous youth. Elizabeth would have been the first to admit that, and he could be wearing on one's patience, but Elizabeth reminded herself that even Will had a special place in her heart. It hadn't been that long ago that he had been just like Chrissy, staring wide-eyed at the giant entrance to the schoolhouse, and huddling close to the floor as he first entered the giant can. Elizabeth told herself that Will had just forgotten this. That did not, however, stop Elizabeth from cutting off Will's laughter with a sharp glance. His voice died in his throat as he met her glare, a glare that, some said, could turn a flame to ice. All Will could manage was a faint croak of, "Sorry."
I'm not the one you nearly scared over the cliff,
Elizabeth answered tersely. Then Chrissy screamed. Elizabeth whirled about, and her heart nearly stopped. A centipede, an especially large one, had climbed up the cliff, its undulating waves of legs propelling it quickly over the side, and Chrissy was pinned beneath it. Will cried out for his sister, while Elizabeth, more decisive than the boy, dashed past the oncoming beast's head, darting straight for the trapped child. The centipede took no notice of Elizabeth as she passed, instead hurtling straight forward. Elizabeth hopped frantically about the centipede's forest of limbs, searching for an opening to reach in for Chrissy, but each time she stretched forth, a new leg flicked past, swatting Elizabeth's hands aside. There was another scream, punctuated with a sickening crunch. The centipede halted in its tracks, its legs digging into the ground to resist some other force that now fought to drag the boneless horror backwards into the barren abyss from whence it came. With the sudden stillness, Elizabeth found her opening. She lunged for a gap between the centipede's legs and took hold of Chrissy's outstretched hands.
"I have you!"
Elizabeth shouted. Unfortunately, so did the centipede. As its legs sunk deeper into the soil, its body pressed down ever more on Chrissy, making it nearly impossible for the young mouse to move. "I can't breathe," Chrissy gasped. Then the centipede began to slip backwards. Hundreds of scars in the dirt appeared as the centipede's legs were torn free and abruptly curled under its body. Chrissy wailed aloud as one such leg jammed into her stomach, pinning her against the centipede's underside. Now there was nothing holding the centipede back. It slid, unchecked, towards the edge, the only resistance being Elizabeth as she clung to her student, digging in her heels as best she could, but whatever was at the other end was considerably stronger.
Will!
Elizabeth shouted.
Get over here! Help us!
Now, whatever else you may think of Will right now, I will say this much. He would have gladly helped, had he been able to make it past the centipede's head. However, the great arthropod was every bit as panicked as the mice, and its head snaked back and forth as it fought to regain its footing, terrifying jaws flashing rapidly across Will's path. The young mouse panicked, as would any child, and hesitated, as would you or I in his position. That was when the centipede caught its second wind. Every leg uncurled and dug to new depths in the ground, plunging down the trenches previously ripped into its path, and pressing its long body ever deeper. Chrissy cried out in surprise as a single limb stabbed into the ground, directly in front of her face. For just an instant the centipede's head was still as a terrible screeching hiss issued from its throat. Will took his chance at that moment, lunging past the centipede's head and scampering to Elizabeth's side.
Good,
Elizabeth gasped.
Now, take your sister's hands.
Will eagerly obeyed, but his heart leapt into his throat as Elizabeth let go.
Where are you going?
He quickly got his answer, however, as Elizabeth scrambled up the centipede's legs, making for the creature's back.
I'm going to make an opening. Now get ready to pull her out.
With that, Elizabeth took hold of a single leg and heaved her feet against the side of the centipede, her entire body straining as she pulled with all the might a mouse could muster. There was a loud pop as the leg snapped clean from its joint. The entire animal shuddered, and its hold on the ground, and, more importantly, Chrissy, loosened. But now the centipede was not only panicked, it was angry. Its head, its savage, venomous jaws curled about. Though it was essentially blind, it could feel the pain in its side and sensed the weight on its back. It lunged, screaming in pain and rage. Elizabeth leapt from the centipede's back just in time to avoid its jaws, but now she was faced with a bigger problem. With so many legs no longer dug into the ground, the centipede's hold was far weaker. The thing at the other end struck again, digging deep into the centipede's back, and with its renewed grip, began pulling all the stronger. Will and Chrissy cried out with one voice as the centipede skidded backwards, and dragged the both of them over the side of the cliff with it. Elizabeth rushed to the edge of the cliff, her mind spinning with all manner of worst-case scenarios, each one worse than the last, but none of that could prepare her for what waited in the gorge below. A gargantuan halberd had its massive blade buried deep in the centipede's armored back. The plates of chitin split open, leaving the wounded flesh underneath to ooze slime and fluids from the terrible gash. There was a sickening squish and squelch as a monstrous hand wrenched the weapon free, and a hulking shape climbed onto the dead centipede's back. Elizabeth gasped in horror. For the moment, the monster was unaware of the two little mice crawling out from beneath his prey. His thin, nearly hairless skin shifted and rippled with the motions of tight, powerful muscle underneath, as the monster pried open the split plates and lowered his toothy, salivating jaws into the wound underneath, eagerly lapping up what remained of the centipede's fluids and chewing at its flesh. Elizabeth's first impulse was to run back to the village for help, but Edge of the Gorge was still a fair distance away, and she couldn't leave the children where they were. In the end, the decision was made for her, as little Chrissy cried out in horror at the sight of the monster, large as life, in the flesh, perched atop the dead centipede. And the monster took notice. He raised his halberd, wiped its blade off on the centipede's armor, and drew his lips back from his teeth in an angry snarl. There was no more time to think. Elizabeth backed away from the cliff's edge for a running start, and then leapt over the side. She crashed onto the monster's back, wrapping one arm around his neck and then grabbing the wrist with her free hand. The monster staggered with a bark of surprise, leaning heavily on his halberd for support. Then his eyes flashed with rage as the situation dawned on him, and he twisted about, his free hand reaching for the mouse on his back as he growled and snarled. Elizabeth flopped back and forth like a rag doll as the enraged monster thrashed about, arms flailing wildly as he fought to get a hold of her. The halberd swept about haphazardly, skidding off the rocky ground and slashing at the earthen underside of the cliff.
"Run, children!"
Elizabeth shouted, swinging back and forth from the monster's shoulders.
"Run!"
If only they could have. Will took Chrissy by the hand, hauling his tiny sister to her feet, and led her quickly in the opposite direction. The gorge, however, was no place for children, and there were far more insidious dangers than the monster in that accursed place. They hadn't gone 5 paces when the ground before them tore open, and a multitude of legs sprang out. "Spider!" Will shouted, leaping backwards. Elizabeth froze, her mouth agape, as she spotted the black beast rushing for the children. She was still just long enough for the monster to get a hold of her. A hand seized Elizabeth by the collar of her cloak and effortlessly flung her aside.
"No!"
She found herself crying out as she helplessly watched the monster draw back his arm and hurl his halberd, spinning.
"No, no, 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 no!"
Both the weapon and the spider bore down on Will and Chrissy as the helpless children huddled together before the end. In a geyser of slime and saliva, the spider and halberd collided head-on, splitting the spider's face in 2 and bringing its rush to a sudden halt, right on top of Chrissy and Will.
"I want to go home!"
Chrissy wailed. In the instant the monster paused for breath, Elizabeth was back on him, arm around his neck with a renewed grip, and now a foot pressed against his shoulders for support. The monster staggered from side to side, both arms reaching as he contorted into odd positions, none of which quite reached Elizabeth. The monster gagged in vain for air as his breath grew stale. His head grew heavy for want of fresh blood flowing to the brain. Little by little, his struggles grew weaker, until finally he collapsed from exhaustion, sending Elizabeth flying clear over his head as he crashed to the ground. Elizabeth landed on her back, knocking the wind from her lungs, and skidded to a halt, her cloak trailing behind. Her chest heaved, aching for want of breath, as she lay stunned. Very faintly in the distance she heard voices, the children calling out.
"Help us!" they cried. "Get us out of here!"
Elizabeth coughed violently as the dagger of breath stabbed its way back into her breast. Head spinning from the motion, she staggered to her feet, disoriented, as she fought to regain her bearings. The unconscious monster lay behind her, his discarded weapon plunged deep down the dead spider's throat. The behemoth's multitude of legs curled beneath it like the bars of a chitin cage.
"A cage!"
Elizabeth gasped.
"Chrissy! Will!"
Head still light, Elizabeth lurched forward, nearly stumbling over her own feet as she broke into a frantic run.
"Hold on! I'll do something."
Elizabeth's confidence faltered as she looked over the tangle of black legs. Under her breath, she softly added,
"I hope."
She rammed her shoulder against the side of the spider. With enough force, perhaps, it might tip over, just enough for... No, the spider was a little too heavy for that. Maybe if she pried back one of the legs, she could clear an opening. Elizabeth cracked her knuckles, took hold of a leg, and heaved for all she was worth. No use. The spider had grown stiff in the wake of its death. "We're stuck, aren't we?" Will spoke up. This was the first time he had faced a real crisis. The shock of it was enough to make him cry. Well, it could be argued he had it coming after his earlier stunt. That did little to help Chrissy, whose wailing easily drowned out Will's.
"No.
Elizabeth answered, a bit harsher than she intended.
We managed with the centipede. This shouldn't be too much different. It's just shorter and thicker and..."
Elizabeth shook her head and slapped herself. She took a deep breath and then clambered up onto the spider's back. She rubbed her hands together and dug her fingers in at the base of a leg.
This worked with the centipede.
She called down to reassure the children. Unfortunately, this was not a centipede. The legs were considerably larger, thicker, and stronger. Strain though she might, Elizabeth simply could not pop it free. Elizabeth paused a moment for breath.
Okay.
She really didn't like the thought of what she was about to do. Visions swam through her mind of the slime trailing from the monster's jaws as he rose from the centipede's back.
You know what they say about desperate times.
Elizabeth threw back her cloak as she leaned forward. The spider's chitin armor gave in easily enough to her teeth. A bitter taste flooded Elizabeth's mouth, nearly knocking her off her feet as her stomach contorted in disgust.
Just a bit more,
Elizabeth told herself.
It won't be long now.
The leg couldn't fall away from the spider's body soon enough. Elizabeth sighed with relief when she saw the two tiny, furry forms dart out from under the carcass. She wiped off her slime-caked mouth on the side of her cloak. She couldn't stand the thought of the slime caking her shoulder, but it was better than leaving it to ooze from her lips. A short, quick hop brought her back to the ground. Will and Chrissy stood rooted to the spot, their eyes fixed on a gaping hole in the ground which led down a wide, web-filled tunnel, the spider's lair. The two huddled together, clinging to one another in a futile desire for safety. Elizabeth, for her part, approached the children with extreme caution, looking over every inch of ground as she stepped tentatively towards them. Will and Chrissy cried out in unison as Elizabeth touched their shoulders.
Hush,
Elizabeth whispered. She glanced about and drew the children close. With a careful eye, she looked each of them over, taking special care to check for infected scratches. The spider had been fast, and Elizabeth was well aware of the venom trapdoor spiders used to subdue prey, whether that prey was as small as a fly or as large as a mouse. Will was scraped up a bit. Bits of fur had been ground off with bits of skin. Chrissy had a few scratches on her arms and shoulders from the centipede's legs. However, there were no bite marks, and the children had been far enough under the spider to avoid the excess venom that now dripped from its fangs.
Good,
Elizabeth sighed.
Now come. If we can make it back to the village, they may be able to rig up something to pull us back up.
But as she took Will and Chrissy by the hands, both of them resisted.
Spiders,
Chrissy whispered.
Yeah,
Will agreed. They could pop out of... At this, he scanned the ground, brow furrowed as he tried to spot even the slightest opening.
Anywhere.
Right.
Elizabeth paused in thought. The sound of flowing water caught her attention. The gorge had a shallow, narrow stream running its length, straight down the center, runoff from higher ground.
This way. I doubt any spider would dig a burrow in a riverbed. The water would flow in and wash the foolish creature away.
The resistance steadily gave way as Elizabeth led her pupils to the stream's edge. Chrissy hesitated a bit when she stuck her toe in the water.
It's freezing,
she whined. Will had a different reaction. His fear of what prowled the shore far outweighed his discomfort in the icy stream. He waded in without hesitation, turning back only to shout,
"Don't be such a baby!"
A faint grunt from the monster's motionless form, however, sent Will scurrying right back to Elizabeth's side.
We can walk along the banks,
Elizabeth concluded.
I doubt any spiders will have burrowed into the ground here either.
Neither child argued, though they did press closer to Elizabeth's sides as the three of them passed the monster's still form. Very, very faintly, Elizabeth could hear Will whisper in shock.
There really is a monster.
No, there's not,
Elizabeth corrected, as much to calm herself as her pupils.
It's just a rat, likely maddened by spider venom.
Yet no sooner had she said so than Elizabeth noticed the monster's features. His head was the wrong shape, sharp and pointed rather than the blunt, rounded shape of a rat. His hands and feet, likewise, were the wrong size for a rat. They were too small and narrow. However large, however scarred and disfigured this monster may have been, he was, clearly, very much a mouse. Elizabeth couldn't see much beyond the cliff tops. She might well have walked clear past edge of the gorge had she not made that same journey along the heights many times before. She had a fair instinct for where she was. Occasionally, Elizabeth called out to see if anyone were there to hear.
Hello!
On her second attempt, she found herself answered with a maddened howl from the direction she had come. Elizabeth fell silent after that. The light had begun to fade by the time Elizabeth dared to call out again. The sun was dipping towards the horizon, and the old firekeeper had taken up his watch for the evening. Initially, he wrote off the cries as the ringing in his ears, but as Elizabeth drew closer and her voice grew louder, the keeper began to make out distinct sounds, and then finally words. The keeper took a moment to shovel another load of grass and bark into the fire, and with the flames burning fresh and bright, he left it to investigate the sounds in the gorge. As he ventured to the cliff's edge, his eyes widened in amazement.
Elizabeth Hartley?
Peering closer, he added,
And 2 children.
Yes,
Elizabeth called back.
Will and Chrissy, Cole's children.
The keeper's nose twitched with curiosity.
What are you all doing down there?
I'll tell you about it later.
Elizabeth answered.
For now, I need you to find help. Maybe throw down a rope.
The keeper nodded.
I'll see what I can do. The gatherers should be returning soon. They'll be of help.
A scream split the air, or perhaps a howl, setting the hair of all 4 mice on end. Will and Chrissy pressed closer to Elizabeth, and the keeper hopped back from the ledge.
Thank you,
Elizabeth shouted.
but please, hurry.
The firekeeper nodded, and turning away, rushed back to the village. Elizabeth glanced over her shoulder. The sight of their encounter with the monster had long since vanished around a bend in the gorge, but that wide, open, empty space filled her with trepidation. She gently ushered the children away from the stream, choosing instead to press against the side of the cliff, where she huddled with the children behind a large white rock. This proved a wise decision. A howl shattered the silence. Peering over the top of the rock, Elizabeth could see a large, pale form lurching along the opposite side of the stream, leaning heavily on a gigantic halberd for support. The monster's gaze fell upon Elizabeth as her head poked above the side of the rock. He remained there, settling into a semi-relaxed crouch, steadily holding that terrible, unblinking stare. Elizabeth broke eye contact for just a moment when she heard the sounds of familiar voices on the cliff overhead, but that was long enough. As soon as she looked back to where the monster had stood, he was gone, as if having vanished into thin air.